There's a moment that keeps appearing in Japanese military diaries from the Pacific War. You can find it in accounts from Guadalcanal in 1942, from the blood-soaked beaches of Tarawa in 1943, from the coral killing grounds of Peleliu, and from the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima in 1945. It's not a moment of triumph or glory. It's a moment of raw, dawning terror. The moment when a Japanese soldier realized that the men advancing toward him were not going to stop. Not when they took casualties, not when the wounded fell, not when the position seemed defensible, or the fire was withering, or the advantage appeared overwhelming. The Marines kept coming. And it was this singular quality, this refusal to acknowledge that the situation demanded anything other than forward movement, that made the United States Marine Corps the most feared fighting force any Japanese soldier ever faced. Today, we're going to dig deep into that story. We're going to understand not just what happened on those islands, but why it happened. What turned ordinary American civilians into something the Imperial Japanese Army genuinely could not comprehend.
What combination of culture, training, technology, and sheer national resources created a fighting force that Japanese commanders spent the last years of the war trying desperately to understand and never found an answer for? This is the story of the Marines in the Pacific, and it begins long before the first shot was ever fired. The making of a Marine. To understand why Japanese soldiers feared the Marines above any other unit, you first have to understand what a Marine actually was in 1942. Because the answer is not simply a well-trained soldier. The answer is something more complicated, and in some ways more unsettling. The Marine Corps in World War II was built on a deliberate, systematic effort to destroy the civilian identity of every recruit who passed through its gates and replace it with something else entirely. At Parris Island, South Carolina, and the recruit depot in San Diego, California, something happened to young Americans that had no real precedent in modern warfare. From the earliest days of the war, nearly 500,000 Marine recruits were trained stateside, each receiving 7 to 8 weeks of training that left them, by the end, fundamentally different people than when they arrived. Picture what that looked like in the winter of 1942, after Pearl Harbor had shocked the nation into action. During the fateful December of 1941, 5,272 recruits arrived on Parris Island, with 9,206 arriving the following month, making it necessary to add additional recruit training battalions. These were young men from every corner of America: factory workers, students, farm boys, clerks. They arrived with civilian habits, civilian thinking, civilian instincts, and from the first moment they stepped off the bus, those instincts were targeted for elimination. The training comprised the fundamentals of military life, including discipline, military courtesy, close order drill, and interior guard duty. Intense physical conditioning and an emphasis on rifle mastery and accuracy on the range was elemental. Marines received 147 hours on the rifle range at Parris Island alone. They were pushed, tested, stripped down, insulted, and exhausted. Men who quit were publicly shamed. The psychological pressure was relentless and intentional. But here's what made Marine training different from simply hard training. It wasn't just about breaking men down. It was about what replaced what was broken. The second half of the process was construction. A recruit who survived was absorbed into something larger than himself, a brotherhood with roots going back 1670 years at the time of World War II, with battles like Belleau Wood and Guadalcanal woven into its identity. Every Marine who ever lived became, in a sense, your brother. To fail in combat was not just to fail yourself, it was to betray every Marine who had died before you. This created a psychological architecture that Japanese military analysts would later study with genuine bewilderment. They had something similar, of course. The Japanese warrior code of Bushido had for centuries created soldiers willing, even eager, to die for their emperor. The concept of gyokusai, or honorable death in battle rather than surrender, became a pervasive ideal for soldiers and civilians alike. This ethos was further reinforced by military codes like the Senjin-kun, which explicitly forbade surrender. Just 5% of Japan's soldiers surrendered during the war. The rest were captured or killed. So both forces had soldiers who would die before surrendering. Both had men who genuinely believed in their cause, who valued collective honor over individual survival. The Japanese code and the Marine ethos were, in this fundamental respect, more alike than different. But there was one crucial, catastrophic difference that Japanese military planners would spend the entire war failing to account for. The Marines had all of that warrior spirit, all of that willingness to die, and behind them stood the full industrial and logistical weight of the United States of America. They were not samurai armed with swords. They were samurai armed with flamethrowers, Sherman tanks, naval gunfire from battleships, and an air force that ruled the skies without challenge. The spirit was equal. The material was not even close. Guadalcanal, the first reckoning. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division came ashore on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. By seizing a strategic airfield site on the island, the United States halted Japanese efforts to disrupt supply routes to Australia and New Zealand. The invasion ignited a ferocious struggle, marked by 7 major naval battles, numerous clashes ashore, and almost continuous air combat. This was America's first offensive operation in the Pacific War, and the Imperial Japanese Army was not particularly worried about it. Japanese forces had swept through China, the Philippines, Malaya, and countless Pacific islands. Their soldiers were veterans, their tactics were proven, their doctrine included the devastating night assault, a specialty at which the Japanese army genuinely excelled, and the terrifying banzai charge, which had shattered enemy units across Asia. Against American troops who had never faced serious combat on an island thousands of miles from home, victory seemed not just probable, but inevitable. Then they met the Marines. In the pre-dawn hours of August 21, the Japanese launched their first ground offensive on Guadalcanal. At the Battle of the Tarawa, U.S. Marine defenders annihilated a force of some 900 veteran Japanese Army troops east of Henderson Field. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki, who led those troops, had commanded men in victorious campaigns against Chinese forces and fully expected his night assault to shatter American defenses. His veterans waded into the Tarawa River at roughly 1:30 in the morning, and what followed was not the route they expected. Marines waited in carefully prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese walked into a killing ground. When the assault stalled and survivors attempted to withdraw, the Marines counterattacked, aggressively in darkness, using automatic weapons and artillery with a precision the Japanese had not anticipated from supposedly soft American soldiers. What happened next was something no Japanese commander had expected. The Americans pursued. Rather than consolidate and defend, the Marines moved forward into the darkness, hunting down survivors with a ferocity that shocked everyone who witnessed it. By dawn, Ichiki's force had been virtually destroyed. This pattern, Japanese night attack, Marine counterattack, savage pursuit, would repeat itself across Guadalcanal for months. Japanese night fighting techniques, initially dominant, gradually lost effectiveness as American forces developed countermeasures, including improved radar, night-fighting aircraft, and coordinated defensive tactics. The campaign demonstrated that Japanese spiritual warfare concepts could not overcome material superiority and sound tactical preparation. But it was more than just tactics. Something about the Marines' willingness to accept casualties and keep fighting defied every lesson Japanese commanders had learned in their previous campaigns. In China, in Malaya, in the Philippines, enemy forces had broken under sufficient pressure. They had retreated when positions became untenable. They had surrendered when surrounded. The Marines did none of these things. On Guadalcanal, American service members battled heat, mosquitoes, disease, dense vegetation, and unfamiliar terrain, along with a determined Japanese enemy, in an all-consuming round-the-clock battle. Supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. After the Navy's disastrous loss at the Battle of Savo Island early in the campaign, the Marines on Guadalcanal were left genuinely isolated, surviving partly on captured Japanese rice. By September, they were fighting on reduced rations. By November, they had been in near-continuous combat for 3 months, and they kept attacking. The Japanese, meanwhile, were running calculations that were starting to produce alarming results. By the end of the campaign, Imperial Japan lost 14,800 killed in action, 9,000 from disease, with 1,000 captured. The Americans had suffered serious losses too, but the Marines and soldiers of the 1st Marine Division had held Henderson Field, the critical airstrip that would prove the key to the entire campaign against repeated attempts to take it back. Japan's first attempt to push the United States out of the Pacific had failed, and the force that had stopped them was the one Japan's military intelligence had described as Americans, individualistic, comfort-seeking, unlikely to tolerate hardship or sacrifice. Every assessment had been wrong.
From Tarawa to Palaliu, the terror deepens. If Guadalcanal introduced Japanese commanders to the problem of fighting Marines, the island-hopping campaign of 1943 and 1944 drove that problem to its most brutal extreme. Each successive battle revealed another layer of what the Marines were capable of, and each revelation was more disturbing than the last. On November 20, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division landed on Betio Island in the Tarawa Atoll, part of Operation Galvanic, aimed at cracking Japan's Central Pacific defenses. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, the Japanese commander, had reportedly boasted that 1 million men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. He had some basis for confidence. At the time, Tarawa was the most heavily defended atoll invaded by Allied forces in the Pacific. The American casualties at Tarawa resulted from several contributing factors, among which were the miscalculation of the tide and the height of the obstructing coral reefs, the operational shortcomings of the landing craft available, and the inability of the naval bombardment to weaken the defenses of a well-entrenched enemy. When the first waves of Marines arrived, they faced a nightmare. Marines had to wade hundreds of yards to shore under the fire of more than 500 Japanese pillboxes. The first wave had 75% casualties. Men were cut down in chest-deep water, hundreds of yards from the beach, with no cover and nowhere to go. In any rational military calculus, this should have been the moment to pull back, to reassess, to call off the assault until conditions improved. Instead, more landing craft arrived, more Marines came ashore. They used the bodies of the fallen as cover. They pushed forward across that killing field with a determination that appalled Japanese defenders, who had expected the catastrophic first-wave losses to end the battle. All but 17 Japanese soldiers died defending Betio. 76 hours after the invasion began, Betio was finally declared secure. Think about that for a moment. During the combat operations, 1,009 Marines were killed and 2,100 wounded. Almost 3,200 total casualties in 76 hours on a piece of ground that measured about 290 acres, smaller than many farms. The casualty rate was staggering, and the Marines had taken every objective.
News of Tarawa spread through the Japanese military. What had happened there could no longer be attributed to poor planning or bad luck on Japan's part. The Marines had landed against every defensive advantage the Japanese possessed and simply refused to be stopped. This was not the behavior of a force that could be defeated by making the price of victory high enough. This was something categorically different. The Battle of Peleliu in September 1944 demonstrated that the Japanese had been paying attention and adapting. Colonel Kunio Nakabawa, commanding the defense, had studied what happened when Japanese forces tried to stop Marine landings at the waterline. He made a radical decision. He would give up the beaches. Instead, on the strategic defensive in late 1944, Imperial Japanese commanders determined that their best course of action lay with the wholesale attrition of American forces. Determined to raise the cost of an Allied victory and hopefully stave off defeat, the Japanese directed their ground forces to hunker down, leverage the defensive terrain of the Pacific Islands, and kill as many Americans as possible. No longer would Japanese forces conduct last-ditch banzai attacks in futile, largely symbolic efforts. Nakagawa built his defense around the Umabrogal Mountain, a jagged mass of coral ridges and natural cave systems that he connected into an interlocking network of mutually supporting positions. Major General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, predicted the island would fall in 4 days. The battle lasted 74 days. The Japanese inflicted 70% casualties on Puller's 1st Marines, or 1,749 men, in just 6 days of fighting in the ridges of the Umabrogal. The 1st Battalion of the 1st Marine Regiment suffered a 71% casualty rate. Individual companies were reduced to handfuls of men. And still the Marines kept attacking, pushing through those ridges yard by yard, calling in artillery and airstrikes, bringing up flamethrower teams and demolition charges, rooting out each defended position one by one. At the battle's conclusion on November 27, 1944, approximately 10,900 Japanese were dead, but at great cost to the United States. The 1st Marine Division was decimated, suffering a loss of 1,300 dead, 5,450 wounded, and 36 missing.
The division was so badly mauled it had to be pulled from action entirely, not returning to combat until Okinawa the following spring. For Japanese commanders, Peleliu was simultaneously encouraging and devastating. Their new tactics had worked. They had inflicted catastrophic casualties on the Marines. But the Marines had still taken the island. They had bled horribly and kept advancing. The attrition strategy that was supposed to halt American momentum had instead become a test of which side could absorb more punishment and continue operating. Japan was winning the attrition battle on some measures, but the United States could replace its losses. Japan could not. The industrial war behind every Marine. You cannot fully understand why the Japanese feared the Marines without understanding what stood behind them. Because the Marines were not just tough fighters, they were the cutting edge of an industrial machine so vast and so efficient that it simply could not be stopped by any strategy Japan could devise. When Japanese scouts observed Marine positions in the days after a landing, they reported back something that initially seemed impossible. They expected to find exhausted, undersupplied troops barely holding on, because that was what Japanese forces would have looked like after 3 days of intense combat on a contested beachhead. What they found instead was something that seemed almost surreal. Marines receiving hot food, ammunition arriving by truck, medical tents treating the wounded with supplies that Japanese medical officers could barely imagine having access to, rest areas where units rotated off the line to recover before going back in. The supply dumps they observed contained more ammunition and materiel than entire Japanese regiments possessed. The Americans had portable kitchens preparing fresh meals. They had clean water. They had blood plasma and antibiotics and surgical teams that saved men who would have died on any other side of this war. They had air power that operated continuously throughout the daylight hours and naval gunfire that could obliterate a hilltop on demand. And behind all of it, thousands of miles away across the Pacific, were the shipyards and factories and training depots of the continental United States, producing more men, more equipment, more ships, more aircraft at a rate Japan simply could not match. This created a form of warfare that operated on a fundamentally different logic from anything Japan had prepared for. Marine close air support techniques, refined under combat conditions, became standard doctrine for subsequent amphibious operations. The integration of naval gunfire, artillery, and air support reached new levels of effectiveness. A Marine platoon pinned down by a Japanese bunker did not simply charge or die. It called in a radio request to a forward observer who directed naval gunfire or artillery onto the position. If that failed, tanks moved forward. If the tanks needed help, flamethrower teams were dispatched. And those flamethrowers deserve special mention because no weapon in the American arsenal produced more visceral dread in Japanese defenders. Over 30% of all Japanese killed on Iwo Jima were not killed by explosions or bullets, but by being incinerated alive by flamethrowers carried in a backpack or the M4 Sherman flamethrower tank. The Marines had developed what they called a corkscrew and blowtorch tactic. Gun-armed Shermans cracked open bunkers with 75mm shells before using flame tanks to douse the insides with burning fluid. The Zippo tanks were much more effective against the caves and reinforced concrete than aerial bombardment or naval artillery. The Japanese troops did everything they could, including suicidal attacks, to stop the Shermans from torching their defenses. But the tanks kept on, dousing the defenders with about 10,000 gallons of napalm every day of the battle. Captain Frank Caldwell, a company commander with the 26th Marines, said of the modified flamethrower tanks, "In my view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle." One of the defining features of Japanese military culture was the concept of dying honorably in combat. Bullets, bayonets, explosives, these were warriors' deaths. Fire was different. Fire was not honorable. Fire was industrial slaughter that reduced human beings to ash without the dignity of a last stand. Japanese soldiers who had been completely willing to die for their emperor found themselves scrambling out of positions they had sworn to defend to the last man, simply to escape the flamethrower teams advancing behind their armored shield. The psychological impact extended well beyond the immediate battlefield. When Japanese commanders tried to calculate how to defeat the Marines, they kept running into the same wall. You could not wear them down. Their logistics were essentially bottomless. Their replacements arrived continuously. Their wounded were evacuated, treated in modern hospital ships offshore, and in many cases recovered and returned to fight again. A Japanese casualty was permanent. An American casualty was frequently temporary.
This asymmetry destroyed every defensive strategy Japan could devise. If you built an impenetrable position, the Marines would call in enough artillery and naval gunfire to make it penetrable. If you inflicted catastrophic casualties in the first wave, the second and third waves kept coming. If you bled a Marine regiment white, it was withdrawn and replaced by a fresh one. There was no threshold of pain that would make the Americans stop. The arithmetic was simply merciless. Pitting spirit against machine, the Battle of Iwo Jima. By early 1945, Imperial Japan had run out of strategies. Every defensive approach had been tested against the Marines and found wanting. Banzai charges had been devastated by Marine firepower and steadiness. Fixed beach defenses had been blasted apart by naval bombardment. The new doctrine of defense in depth, introduced at Peleliu, had inflicted terrible casualties, but the Marines had still taken the island. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was assigned to defend Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island roughly halfway between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland. Kuribayashi was among the most capable defensive commanders Japan produced in the entire war. He was also, by this point, entirely clear-eyed about what he was facing. Kuribayashi recognized that he could not defeat an American landing.
Instead, he planned a long and costly defensive battle to shake American resolve to continue the war and invade the Japanese mainland. His preparation was extraordinary. By the time the Americans invaded on February 19, 1945, 18 kilometers of a planned 27 kilometers of tunnels had been dug. Besides numerous command centers and barracks 75 feet below ground, tunnels allowed for troops to move undetected between defensive positions. Hundreds of hidden artillery and mortar positions were placed all over the island, and many areas were extensively mined. Within Mount Suribachi and underneath the rocks, 750 major defense installations were built to shelter guns, blockhouses, and hospitals. On Mount Suribachi alone, there were 1,000 cave entrances and pillboxes. Kuribayashi also made the decision that distinguished his defense from every previous Japanese effort. He banned the Banzai charges. No waste of lives in futile last stands. His men would stay in their tunnels, draw the Marines into killing grounds, inflict casualties, withdraw through the underground passages when positions became untenable, and begin again. Every Marine killed, every day of combat extended, was a blow against American will. That was the entire strategy. On February 19, 1945, approximately 70,000 U.S. Marines from 3 divisions came ashore on Iwo Jima. The opening phase was already catastrophic. Kuribayashi let the first waves land almost unmolested, waiting until the beach was crowded with men and equipment before opening up with everything he had simultaneously. Despite 519 killed in action and another 47 who died of wounds on the first day, 30,000 U.S. Marines made it ashore. And then they started advancing inland. What followed over the next 36 days was, in raw human terms, perhaps the most brutal, sustained close combat any American unit has ever experienced. Every meter of ground was paid for in blood. Marines would clear a bunker with grenades and flamethrowers, advance past it, and find that Japanese defenders had moved through the tunnels and reoccupied it behind them. Positions that appeared secured would suddenly erupt with fire. The terrain offered no cover, no relief, no rest. The black volcanic sand swallowed boots. The heat was punishing. The smell was indescribable. And still the Marines advanced. The final death toll among Marines was 5,931 killed in action, died of wounds, or missing in action, and presumed dead. More than twice as many Marines as had been killed in all of World War I. Total American casualties for the 36-day battle exceeded 26,000. Each Japanese defender was expected to die in defense of the homeland, taking 10 enemy soldiers in the process. In the end, almost all of them died. Of the 20,000-strong Japanese garrison, 216 were taken prisoner. Perhaps 3,000 more scattered into the tunnel network. The rest were dead. Kuribayashi's defense had been brilliant. It was also irrelevant. The Marines took every objective. They raised the flag on Mount Suribachi on February 23rd, 4 days into the battle, while most of the island was still contested. They fought through the Meat Grinder and Bloody Gorge, positions named by the men who died taking them, and by March 26th, Iwo Jima was declared secure. Iwo Jima saw the only major battle in the entire Pacific campaign where American casualties surpassed the Japanese dead.
Kuribayashi had achieved everything his strategy aimed for, inflicting maximum casualties on a marine force that simply would not stop.
And none of it had saved the island. None of it had halted American momentum. None of it had changed the outcome. What the Japanese learned and what it means. After the war, Japanese veterans and military analysts were given the opportunity to say in post-war interrogations and interviews what they had actually experienced fighting the Marines. The accounts are remarkably consistent. The fear wasn't of any single tactic or weapon, though the flamethrower terrified everyone who encountered it. The fear was of something more fundamental. It was the refusal to stop. Japanese military culture had spent centuries developing men willing to die for their cause. It had built armies that would charge into machine gun fire, that would hold impossible positions to the last man, that would endure privations that broke other armies. It had created warriors who genuinely did not fear death. And it had faced, in the Marines, a force that matched every one of those qualities, and added something the Japanese military simply could not produce. The Marines had everything Japan claimed its soldiers had: discipline, courage, esprit de corps, absolute commitment to the mission, and a willingness to die before surrendering ground. But they also had Sherman tanks, naval gunfire from battleships, continuous air cover from carrier-based aircraft, unlimited ammunition, sophisticated medical care, and a replacement pipeline that could absorb catastrophic casualties and send fresh men into the line. Guadalcanal marked the definitive end in Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. The loss of experienced pilots, naval vessels, and ground forces created shortages that Japan never recovered from during the remaining war years. The final assessment that emerges from every Japanese account of fighting the Marines is the same one that Kuribayashi himself articulated in his dispatches from Iwo Jima. The Marines were the finest soldiers he had encountered. Their training was superior, their equipment was overwhelming, their courage was equal to anything Japan possessed, and their numbers were endless. Consider the overall numbers across the Pacific campaign. The Marines had almost 20,000 killed in the war against Japan. They fought in every major island campaign, from Guadalcanal in August 1942 to Okinawa in June 1945. They never failed to take an objective. They never abandoned a position once captured. They never gave Japanese forces any reason to believe that the Marines could be defeated through superior tactics or fighting spirit. The price was terrible. The results were absolute. And in post-war years, Japanese veterans who had survived the islands where Marines fought gave strikingly honest accounts of what they had experienced. Not just fear, though fear was certainly present. Something closer to a grudging, painful respect. The recognition that they had faced men who were everything their own propaganda had claimed Japanese soldiers were, backed by everything Japan had failed to provide its own troops. Spirit plus material, courage plus firepower, willingness to die plus the resources to win. That combination, as Japanese veterans concluded nearly unanimously, was unbeatable. And the Marines, across 3 years of brutal island warfare, proved it one island at a time, at a cost that still echoes through American military history. They paid whatever price the battle demanded. They never stopped advancing. They never surrendered an objective. And they left Japanese commanders with a conclusion that no amount of bravery or sacrifice could change. Some enemies cannot be stopped by making victory expensive. The Marines would pay the price and take the ground anyway. That's why Japanese soldiers feared fighting the Marines more than any other unit, not because of any single weapon or tactic, because of what the Marines were and what stood behind them. If you found this story as compelling as we did, hit that like button and subscribe to War Chronicles 1940. We cover the stories of the Second World War that deserve deeper telling, and there are plenty more where this one came from. Share this with a history fan who'd appreciate the detail, and drop a comment below. We'd love to hear what you think, or what battles and units you'd like us to cover next. We'll see you in the next one.